everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Karen Burchill, aka Creative Katie. Today I have a mixed media tutorial. I'll be using rice paper and I'll be working on an 11 by 14 MDF panel. But you can do this exact same process on an art journal page or whatever substrate you want. So this one started off with a build your stash session. I have a lot of white napkin layers, and one of the best ways of using those layers is to grab out your stamps and stamp with acrylic paint. Here I'm using brown, and you can make your own designer papers. Now, when you put the stamp with acrylic paint on the napkin, you need to lift it up fairly quickly or the napkin may rip a little bit because it is very fragile when it gets wet. So the stamps that I'm using here, I chose because they give that vintage vibe. I'm using the sparkly motif is the mandala looking one. Right now I'm using Words from Stamperia, and the Franz one is from Solid Florals. And I will give you a link to all of those in the description box below. All of those can be purchased at NinnysNapkins.com. So now I'm doing one in black. So when I've gotten out the paint and I've dirtied up my stamps, I do multiple sheets all at one time. That means only one cleanup, and then these go into my stash that I can use not only on the project that I'm using, but future projects, which means I can get to the page a lot faster. So as I said, I'm working on an 11 by 14 MDF panel, and I've gessoed it. Now, what you're seeing me do here is I am ripping from the rice paper Protea, also purchased from NinnysNapkins, and I've ripped it apart to use it and build the composition the way I want it. So I'm playing with the composition, putting it in two corners, putting my tissue paper, my designer napkin collage paper behind it and just getting the look. And here I'm going with the brown. There's a lot of brown with the pink and the green from the rice paper. So that is going to direct my color scheme. And the rest of that rice paper is going into my stash, and you'll see me using it on mini makes or on another art journal page. Now, I don't need the stamping underneath the rice paper. In fact, I don't want that darkness to come through, so I'm not going to decoupage any of that designer napkin underneath it. And I'm ripping it apart. And this way you can pick elements that you like from your designer collage papers that you created. Now, when I use rice paper, I always hesitate to rip them apart because they're so beautiful in of themselves. But I need to look at it as not a finished art piece. I need to look at it as a supply, a mixed media art journal supply. Now I'm gluing this down with fluid matte medium. This is Liquitex Basics. And the white part of the napkin just disappears. Of course, I am on a white background. I could have colorized the panel underneath first, but I decided to keep it white, and I guess I was going for a lighter feel with this. Now, spoiler alert, you are going to see me create two similar backgrounds because I end up in a place where it wasn't the look I was going for. So I end up basically redoing the background, but I kept all that footage in to show you that you always have options. So if you like the first way that I'm showing, you can duplicate that And if you like the second way, you now have me doing the work and you getting the lesson. So that Protea rice paper, instead of putting it in the two corners, I decided to build up the display in just the one corner. And I did that because I tend to do the two corners a lot, and I wanted to try something different. And I'm gluing that down with my fluid matte medium from Liquitex Basics as well. The rice paper doesn't go as translucent as napkins, but you can still, at the top there where I still had some script right underneath it, it did come through. So if you don't want something to come through, white out that area or don't put any color or marking because it will change the colors and the look of your rice paper. But if you want script to show up underneath it, definitely put it underneath. So now I need to add some texture. And I'm taking some thick gesso and I'm rubbing it through this linked tiles stencil. This is one of my favorite stencils. It seems to work so well on so many projects. Now, using thick gesso, instead of modeling paste, you get a little bit less texture. It's smoother. It's not as precise, but it is one of my favorite ways of getting texture. I just love the look of it. Just make sure you clean your stencil after you've put the gesso on it. Now I just want to make sure that the edges disappear. Now, if you've used scissors, this might be a little bit more important. I ripped, and so you get that blend of the edges a little bit more, but I just wanted a little bit more. I wanted it a little bit of a halo around my focal image. Now I'm playing with a couple sentiments and I'm putting them where I want to have them in the end. So I don't put too many markings because I know I'm just going to have to white it out. I don't want texture there. I'm using this kaleidoscope stencil here with the green that's in the rice paper just to add a little bit more interest to the background. Now I'm using the colors. I'm using alizarin crimson and Naples yellow, which is the color of the Protea. And I'm just rubbing that pink a little bit. I want the illusion that there are more of these Protea plants in the background. So you're seeing one really close up and all the rest are in the back. And I'm just rubbing with a makeup sponge with my fingers these colors. While I wanted to go vintage, I did want to keep the background fairly light. So I'm wiping back a little bit. That's highlighting the texture and letting me see that texture and showing off the interest that's you're building into a mixed media background. So now I am going to overpaint on top of the rice paper. And what I figured out by trial and error is first go in with some globby white gesso and then come in with the colors. And part of the original rice paper napkin focal image is there and it becomes very abstract. Now you could leave it the way it was if this step scares you, but I hope you practice it off a page or off a canvas and get it because it is a wonderful technique to use. It adds texture and it really makes it more your own. So I put the white gesso, which kind of gives it the highlights. The dark parts are usually what's already in the rice paper. And then I'm using colors that I'm matching as close to it. By adding this layer of paint, it adds the texture, but it also brightens the colors and makes it more of a focal image, makes it stand out. But you can see I'm not being too terribly precise. I'm using a very small angle brush, and I go back in with the white gesso, with the alizarin crimson, with the Naples yellow. If you don't like what is, you can always let it dry and then come back to it, because once the acrylic paint's dry, you can go. Now, originally I was only going to do a few of these and leave some flat, just the original, but I kept going. Now I'm adding some darks with the black, doing the same painterly effect with the greens. And, you know, that one flower, Protea, at the bottom right-hand corner, it didn't look as precise as the others, and I was a little scared of it, but I said, you know what, jump in. So I didn't put as globby paint. I made this look more watercolory, which is what it was in the original, but I just did a wash of the colors and a little bit of the gesso. And I'm happy with how it ended up. So, you know, take the challenge. If you want to practice, print off a picture, put it down and just paint on the picture and hone those skills. Now I wanted this to look vintage, so I'm coming in and I wanted to do a wash of brown to make it get kind of grungy vintage. And it just, well, I'm just going to say it got too dark for me. And it changed the whole look. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. So I play with it, bringing out you can see where I wipe back where the gesso is. The gesso acts as a bit of a resist, so that texture really pops, and I'm liking that effect. I'm thinking, okay, what if I edge it with the black? So that's what I'm doing now, just to see how it will finish. Because sometimes when you don't do the finishing work, you may not be happy, but once you go and do the finishing stuff. So now I'm taking black because I want to bring out that texture a little bit more. And this is where it really got too dark. Now, don't get me wrong, in another application on another page, I may want this, but it just didn't feel right. So I think, okay, I'm going to add a little more stamping. Some of my stamping disappeared. Adding some shading on the Protea using black, or a mixture of black and the alizarin crimson. Trying to lighten it a little bit. Adding more color. I'm trying to adjust it to fit the picture in my head of where I thought this was going or where I wanted it to go. Thought, okay, I'm going to splatter. I'm going to splatter with gold. That might brighten and lighten. And then I splatter with white because I want to lighten it. And sometimes that does the trick. And so now we have background version number 1. And while I like it, I didn't love it. So the next day, I decide, you know what? If this was an art journal page, I probably would put on the sentiment and go. But it's an MDF panel. So I thought, you know, I'm going to work it. So I grab my white gesso and I'm just applying the gesso and getting rid of the background. Now, in doing that, all the textures that's there from the gesso, from the thick gesso, from the collage papers, that will remain. What disappears is all the stamping from the designer napkin that we made. But I loved the combination of the stamps that I used, so I'm going to just stamp on this background. So all isn't lost. I didn't want to decoupage another layer of napkin because I didn't want to lose the texture from the thick gesso. So now basically I'm doing the same thing, but I'm going to work hard to keep the background white. So again, I'm rubbing the pink in. Some of the gesso is still wet. I want this to look like the Protea flowers are in the background. I'm adding a little bit of the brown at this stage instead of doing a wash. And then I'm going to put a little bit of green. And that mirrors all the colors that were in that rice paper. It had brown, it had white, it had the green. Now my background, because it's white gesso, looks a little bit too white. So I grabbed, either this is parchment paper, or no, unbleached titanium. And it's just the right color. It matches the colors that are on the Protea rice paper. And I'm mixing that in. I'm going over top of some of my other colors. And now I'm going to add the stamping, and I'm putting acrylic paint right onto it and stamping with the acrylic paint. That's the Words stamp by Stamperia. This one is Solid Florals, which I absolutely love. There's 2 stamps in that kit. Now, I'm not worried about it not being perfect because this is supposed to look vintage. It's not supposed to look perfect. Right now, it looks a little bit too up front, but I'm going to show you how to push that back in a minute. And again, I plan on using the sentiment with put it on tissue paper, so I don't want any of this dark stamp underneath. So I'm putting a whole placeholder where I think I'm going to put the sentiment. This is the script stamp from Darkroom Door, one of my favorites. And I choose not to use that sparkly motif stencil that looked like a mandala. As much as I loved it, I thought it was a little too much for this application, but I will be using it again. Now I'm just taking a little bit of a wash of white gesso and pushing parts of that stamping back and keeping my background light. Remember, I wanted it to be light. Now I grabbed my favorite DIY mark making tool. This is a sink liner, and I'm rubbing thick gesso on it and stamping with it. This is adding texture, it's adding pattern, and it's brightening the page. And just a reminder, just because I'm doing this on an MDF panel doesn't mean that this can't be done in an art journal. So I'm absolutely loving the look of the background now. And I'm so happy that I decided to basically start over with the background. Now I'm taking some black paint on a makeup sponge and I'm rubbing it over the stenciled gessoed areas. I want to bring out that texture. I want to see it a little bit more and add a little bit of grunge. So I'm coming in and it was the dark brown, I think it's burnt umber paint on top, just to bring it out. Now here I have the sentiments and I'm cutting the tissue paper to size. You want it inside the page, and then you're going to tape it down on the page. Now I have it underneath so I know where the text is going to be, so I know where I need tissue paper. You want to tape this down really well. Get rid of all the crinkles and lines. And then you're going to feed it through your printer. Now I have a laser printer. And it comes off. Now it's easy to cut this when there's that paper underneath. Now, a word about printing on tissue paper. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. You be prepared to maybe do it twice. So I'm cutting this sentiment apart, removing excess tissue. The tissue paper, once I decoupage this down, is going to turn translucent, especially since I have a light background. Sometimes you'll see a little bit if your background was really dark. I have it in place. I'm putting a good amount of the matte medium underneath and then on top. You don't spare the matte medium at this point. The more you put on the tissue paper, the less likely you're going to see the tissue paper. And the sentiment is from my I believe it's from the Time sentiment pack. You know those things you've always wanted to do? You should do them. I'll list the correct sentiment pack in the description box below. Now I'm painting the sides. I'm edging with black and I do paint the sides with black. This has a keyhole cut in the back of the MDF panel so it will hang flat on the wall. Now I'm coming back and I'm splattering with black this time and white and gold. Which background did you like the best? Did you like the darker one or do you like this lighter one? There it is on a plate display, but it could also be hung on a wall. Close up of the texture. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you give this a try. Check out other tutorials. And until next time, go get creative.